Belarus stands at a crossroads, caught between its historic ties to Russia and an uncertain future in Europe. Its capital, Minsk, home to 2 million people, ranks among Europe's largest cities, yet Belarus is often labeled as Europe's last dictatorship, ruled by Alexander Lukashenko for nearly 3 decades. His grip has tightened through suppression, human rights violations, weaponizing migration, and backing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The exiled leader of the opposition warns, "He's turning my country into the North Korea of Europe. Non-transparent, unpredictable, and dangerous." So where is Alexander Lukashenko taking Belarus? And how much longer can he count on Moscow's support? In this video, we're going to unravel Belarus's complex past and why it's becoming the North Korea of Europe. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Belarus, like many former Soviet states, found itself at a crossroads. It had the opportunity to transition into a democracy and build a market economy. But in 1994, that path was altered when Alexander Lukashenko won the country's first presidential election. At the time, Lukashenko presented himself as an anti-corruption crusader, appealing to a population struggling with post-Soviet instability. His promises of restoring order and protecting social welfare resonated with many. However, once in power, he quickly dismantled democratic institutions and concentrated power in his own hands. In 1996, Lukashenko pushed through a controversial referendum that significantly expanded his authority, allowing him to dissolve parliament and rule by decree. He also extended his term limits, ensuring he could stay in power indefinitely. Opposition voices were silenced, independent media was shut down, and political rivals either disappeared or were imprisoned. By the early 2000s, Belarus had become a full-fledged dictatorship. Elections became mere formalities. Reports of vote rigging, repression, and voter intimidation became the norm. The 2020 election was the tipping point. When Lukashenko claimed victory with 80% of the vote, mass protests erupted across the country. Thousands took to the streets, demanding change. His response? A brutal crackdown. Security forces arrested over 65,000 people, using torture and violence to crush dissent. Since then, Belarus has spiraled further into isolation, with Lukashenko doubling down on repression. The nation has become a police state, where fear rules and democracy is a distant dream. What happened in 2020 wasn't just another rigged election, it was the final nail in the coffin of Belarus's democracy. Fast forward to January 26, 2025. Belarus holds an early presidential election. Officially, this was done to ensure stability, but in reality, it was a calculated move by Alexander Lukashenko to solidify his grip on power before opposition forces could regain momentum. The result? A staggering 87.6% of the vote in Lukashenko's favor, an outcome that surprised absolutely no one. But calling this an election is misleading. It was nothing more than a political theater. No independent observers were allowed, opposition candidates were either jailed or forced into exile, and state-controlled media ensured that Lukashenko was the only serious contender in the race. By the time voting began, many Belarusians already knew the outcome was predetermined. The European Parliament quickly condemned the election as a sham. Human rights organizations pointed out that Belarusians were voting under extreme duress. Citizens feared that not participating, or worse, voting for the opposition, could lead to repercussions. In previous elections, authorities had been known to track votes, intimidate opposition supporters, and even fabricate turnout numbers to give the illusion of legitimacy. This time was no different. Internationally, the reaction was swift. 41 countries and 7 international organizations refused to recognize the results. Opposition leader Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who's been in exile since fleeing Belarus after the 2020 election, denounced the vote as fraudulent and called on the world to impose tougher sanctions. She urged Belarusians to resist, but inside the country, resistance was dangerous. Protesters were arrested within minutes of the gathering. Dissent had become almost impossible. But Lukashenko's biggest backer, Russia, quickly congratulated him. The Kremlin, which has increasingly treated Belarus as a puppet state, welcomed the election as a success. Vladimir Putin views Lukashenko as a crucial ally in his geopolitical strategy, using Belarus as a buffer against NATO and a staging ground for military operations. With Russia's support, Lukashenko has been able to withstand international pressure, allowing him to continue his authoritarian rule with little fear of consequences. This election wasn't about democracy, it was about control. It sent a clear message: Lukashenko isn't going anywhere. The institutions that could have checked his power no longer exist, and with his grip tightening, Belarus is moving even closer to a complete dictatorship. The question now is, how much worse can it get? The 2025 presidential election wasn't just a political manipulation. It was a reaffirmation of the brutal system that Alexander Lukashenko has built over the past 3 decades. In Belarus, simply speaking against the government can land you in prison. Protesting can result in years behind bars. Even something as small as following an opposition channel on social media can be considered a crime. Since 2020, over 65,000 people have been arrested for political reasons. Right now, at least 1,200 political prisoners remain behind bars. These aren't just opposition politicians or activists. They are students, teachers, journalists, and even ordinary citizens who dare to voice their opinions. Some of them have been sentenced to more than 20 years in prison for nothing more than criticizing the regime. But imprisonment isn't the worst fate. Reports from human rights organizations describe harrowing accounts of torture in Belarusian detention centers. At least 7 political prisoners have died in custody since 2020, under conditions that remain suspicious. Independent media no longer exists in Belarus. Journalists have been forced to flee, and those who remain risk being labeled as extremists. Even reading or sharing banned news can lead to arrest. The government controls all major TV channels and newspapers, ensuring that only pro-Lukashenko propaganda reaches the public. Any hint of dissent is erased before it can spread. Even the internet isn't safe. Lukashenko's regime uses advanced surveillance tools, many provided by Russian and Chinese technology firms, to monitor online activity. Telegram channels that once served as a platform for protesters are now under heavy scrutiny. In some cases, authorities have forced people to unlock their phones at police checkpoints to check for subversive content. If they find anything critical of the government, the punishment is swift and brutal. The psychological toll is huge. People live in constant fear, unsure if a neighbor, co-worker, or even family member might secretly give information about them. Belarus has become a country where silence is survival. Lukashenko's message is clear. If you oppose him, he will break you. And with every new crackdown, Belarus edges closer to becoming the North Korea of Europe. Where loyalty is demanded, fear is constant, and hope is all but extinguished. Belarus's transformation into Europe's most isolated country didn't happen overnight. For years, Lukashenko played a balancing act, keeping close ties with Russia while maintaining some degree of independence. But after the 2020 protests and subsequent Western sanctions, that balance collapsed. Today, Belarus is more reliant on Vladimir Putin than ever before, effectively becoming a puppet state of Moscow. Sanctions imposed by the EU, the US, and other Western nations have crippled key sectors of Belarus's economy, especially its once thriving IT industry. Before 2020, Belarus was known as the Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe, with companies like EPAM Systems and Wargaming employing tens of thousands. But after the crackdown, many of these companies relocated to Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, taking skilled workers and millions of dollars in tax revenue with them. With Western markets cut off, Belarus has had no choice but to deepen its dependence on Russia. In 2023, Lukashenko allowed Russian nuclear weapons to be stationed on Belarusian soil, a move that alarmed NATO and pushed the country further into geopolitical isolation. The Belarusian military, once an independent force, is now heavily integrated with Russian command structures. And Minsk has been accused of assisting in Russia's invasion of Ukraine by allowing troops to move through its territory. Meanwhile, the country's state-controlled economy is in freefall. Inflation remains high, foreign investment has dried up, and the ruble continues to weaken. While Russia provides loans, cheap oil, and security guarantees, this relationship comes at a cost. Belarus is no longer a fully sovereign nation, but a de facto extension of Putin's empire. Despite the suffocating grip of Lukashenko's regime, recent events suggest that change, though distant, may not be entirely impossible. Over the past year, Belarus has made small but noticeable moves that hint at potential shifts in its political landscape. However, whether these developments signal real change or just strategic maneuvering by the regime remains uncertain. One of the most unexpected moments came in February 2025, when Belarus released several high-profile political prisoners, including a US citizen and an independent journalist. Among them was Andriy Kuzniechik, a journalist for Radio Free Europe, who had been sentenced under false charges of extremism. While this move was welcomed by human rights organizations, many experts believe it was a calculated attempt by Lukashenko to improve ties with the West. Internationally, the pressure on Belarus has not let up. The European Union and the United States have continued to impose new sanctions, targeting individuals and state-run enterprises that support Lukashenko's rule. In response, Lukashenko has started to distance himself slightly from Russia, fearing that his complete dependence on Putin could make him disposable. He has even hinted at possible peace talks regarding Ukraine, a remarkable shift from his previous stance of full alignment with Moscow. On the ground, resistance is still alive. Despite the risk of arrest, underground activist groups continue to operate, using encrypted messaging apps and VPNs to spread anti-government information. The Belarusian diaspora, now scattered across Europe and beyond, remains vocal in its efforts to keep global attention on the country's plight. Opposition leader Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, now in exile, has intensified her diplomatic efforts, meeting with world leaders to push for a free Belarus. But for most Belarusians, daily life remains bleak. Hope exists, but it is fragile under an oppressive regime, one that has earned Belarus the grim nickname the North Korea of Europe. Without mounting external pressure, Lukashenko's reign of repression seems destined to continue. The real question is, how long can he hold on? Is Belarus truly the North Korea of Europe? Let me know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more geopolitical breakdowns.